Welcome, everybody. It is my honor to welcome you to the first installment of our three-part social equity series this spring. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us for this discussion. I want to thank the faculty for helping us put this together, and to my fellow committee members who will be in the chat keeping an eye on things and answering any questions. My name is Danielle Edwards. I'm an accelerated master's student of public administration here at the School of Public Affairs, and I will be your moderator for this panel discussion on Ibram X. Kendi's 2019 How to Be an Anti-Racist. This one. This book lays the groundwork for our two upcoming events later this spring, but today we will have a meaningful discussion on what it means to be an anti-racist, as well as how anti-racism interacts with the policy process with our panelists, who are a mix of scholars and practitioners. This event will consist of a panel discussion with prepared questions. As we discuss this book, we invite you to reflect, and you're welcome to write in the chat, both anonymously in the Q&A box at the bottom, or just in the chat. And we will also be having periodic polls that you can respond to anonymously as well. Without further ado, I have the privilege of introducing our panelists. We have Dr. John Ronquillo and our doctoral student, Yohn. We unfortunately could not have Dr. Anthony Stark with us due to an unexpected family loss. So let's kick off this discussion by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. So tell us about yourself, your research, and how that connects to DEI or the policy process. Hope, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. Hi, I'm Yohn. I am a PhD student with the School of Public Affairs at CU Denver. I am a first year in my second semester, and I am hoping to research the organizational development of criminal justice institutions. I have a career in training, learning, and organizational development, so I spend a lot of time building curriculum for managers and training employees on their jobs, as well as company culture, organizational development, and DEI. So in that same vein, I spent a lot of time thinking about organizational values and how those factor in how we treat each other, as well as how we perpetuate racist ideas and policies, particularly how the absence of DEI policies in companies and organizations, especially criminal justice institutions, can is filled by those racist ideas that we see come down from racist policies. And that permeates our culture. So that's me. I'll pass it over to Dr. Ronquillo.
Thanks, Hope, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Ronquillo. I'm on the faculty here at the School of Public Affairs. I'm in my 8th year, and I teach and research in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, I've done work most recently on social equity. I've written with some of our previous SPA PhD students in this area, and I like to examine issues of representation within organizations. I've done work that has circumnavigated around Indigenous communities in particular, and am looking to expand that. I teach courses in public service, leadership, and ethics to our accelerated students, many of whom are on today's seminar. I also teach a PhD seminar in public management, as well as an intensive course in organizational behavior, where I do try to infuse elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, various ideas of representation, and also issues of justice. We are seeing the acronym or the initialism change quite a bit within different spheres. So if you've heard EDI, DEI, JEDI, we're all traversing on similar, very important issues here. And I'm very excited to be here with everyone. I'm excited to be a co-panelist with Hope, and we're looking forward to a stimulating conversation today.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to first put up a poll, and our panelists can answer this as well. And What did you see as the opposite of racism before reading Kendi's book? Which ideas were unfamiliar with you before reading Kendi's book? When did race come? When did race come for you? Were conversations about race part of your upbringing? Were conversations about race a part of the curriculum in your schooling? Those kind of questions. Do our panelists want to respond to anything that they, found interesting within these questions, so to say? Like, a majority of our audience did see that not racist was what they came in believing what the opposite of racism is. I thought that.
I'll respond to some of the, the conversations about race as part of upbringing curriculum. I recall, like, I grew up in a really diverse and integrated area. So there was I had a strong awareness of race and ethnicity from a young age. Not to mention, I was raised by a white father and Latina mother. So it was very obvious even in my own home. But it was not a part of the conversation at all. It was not something we talked about. It was honestly something that if you mentioned someone's race, it was kind of like, that's not very polite. And it was certainly not a part of my school curriculum. And so I really related to that part of Dr. Kendi's work, especially when he talks about talking about it with your children, because it's unavoidable in our world. But when you don't have the language for it, and so it internalized for me shame around talking about race. So that's something that I have really appreciated from just engaging with Dr. Kendi's work, that awareness that it is a part of our children's life. And, as an adult now, I don't have children of my own, but I have nieces and nephews and godchildren. And I do see how race impacts them and how talking about it, gives them that language and that head start to deal with these uncomfortable, topics.
And I guess I can build on that a little bit. One of the questions that I found interesting was, when did race come for you in terms of where we are? Within my research, in particular, depending on who my collaborators are, we have a lot of discussions on positionality when it comes to why we're undertaking said research and where we come from, essentially. So when did race come for you? For me, it came in early childhood. Like Hope, I came from a multicultural, multiracial background, a white mother and an Apache Mexican father. Actually, my father had several different indigenous cultures, including one called the Seri, which are located in Sonora, Mexico, and who are essentially endangered. There are fewer than 1,000 of them left. And so for me, it came in a lot of different ways, in the sense that I knew on a cursory level what my heritage was. But at the same time, I can't say that early childhood I had a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a person who was indigenous, or a person who was Latino or Chicano, or a person who was white, because I have to own that part of me that is white as well, and to acknowledge the difficulty that it is sometimes in being a multicultural, multiracial individual, because I have been in uncountless times in my life been othered. And to be blunt, I'm too brown for white folks and too white for brown folks sometimes. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And it's part of a reason why I think that topics such as this are important. And I think that as I was able to mature and grow and better understand, my heritage, I joke a lot about saying, that where I grew up in Arizona, where my family originated, the border crossed us, we didn't cross it. And especially in terms of claiming my indigeneity, issues around tribal enrollments, which is an incredibly new system in terms of the relationships between the United States federal government and the 574 federally recognized tribes. One of my indigenous cultures is embedded in Mexico, and so there is not a process for enrollment and recognition in that regard. Furthermore, I had two grandfathers who completely eschewed their identity. They in the time in which they came up were ashamed of being Indigenous. And so rather than being mislabeled as somebody who was Apache, I had a great grandfather, who was fluent in Spanish, because at that point in time, that was the colonizer language that was being spoken. He would get, just that much better treatment identifying as a Mexican, as opposed to being somebody of Indigenous descent. And so this heritage was something that I had to reclaim as I aged and grew up, and as I learned stories. I have a relative who was a historian who wrote a kind of a hybrid ethnography, based in social science, but also a memoir of her own lived experience growing up in Tucson, which is the area in southern Arizona where my family originated. So for me, race came relatively early, but my understanding and context of that didn't come until much later. And then some of the questions that Hope addressed, the same for me. They weren't things that were discussed. They were, in fact, I would say, actively discouraged. So I appreciate that we're at a point in time, and especially in venues such as this, where we can openly discuss these things and think deeply upon how they resonate within society and why they're important to our communities moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you both for being vulnerable and sharing with us those stories. Now that we have a bit of a background where us as individuals come from, let's talk about what were your impressions of Kendi's book? Anything you connected with or disagreed with? Because I know there's a lot of conversation that is very mixed about different opinions. And so, do you have any opinions of the book that you would like to share with us? And again, in the chat, people are free to respond to these questions as well. You can do them anonymously in the Q&A. So I just want to open this up.
Sure. I personally really connect to the idea that there is no neutral, especially in our very racist society, in our hierarchical culture that we all are soaked in already. And the anti-racist work is something that we're all always striving for. And I also really appreciate Dr. Kendi's take that individual people are not inherently racist or anti-racist. It is something that we are always working towards or not working on, and we change and grow. We can be both racist and anti-racist in the same day, in the same hour, but it's just it's about that intention of working against anti-racist working against racist policies that really perpetuate the racist ideas. There's nothing I inherently disagreed with. I do think something that I struggled with a little bit upon initially reading it, and it helped me to unpack it a little bit, is just the concept of policy in general. I think I was I was at some point led to believe that policy had to do with national legislation, and I think it's important to talk about the fact that there are policies all around us, state and local policies, not to mention company policies, school policies. We have policies in our nonprofits, in the places we shop, in our community groups, even sometimes unspoken policies in the way that we can communicate with our friends and family. And we all have power in those places, even if we don't feel like we have power necessarily in a legislative venue. And so, it was helpful for me to think about those policies that I do have an impact on, and that I can help turn towards anti-racist policies.
Yeah, and I would agree, I guess, on the policy issue. I think Hope identified something good there. For me, as someone who I feel like I dip my toes in a lot of areas, being a scholar within public administration, because we are influenced by a lot of other disciplines. I believe that public administration is inherently an applied field, where my own work has been influenced by a lot as well. And so I think, Dr. Kendi's book is incredibly important on a lot of different levels. But I do also want to ensure that as we continue to foster these types of discussions, that we're pulling in other resources and other things that have also influenced his work, right? I mean, as important as the work is, he has become a popular poster child for discussing a very important topic. But I do think that his can be a starting point for us, for example. We all have folks who we probably want to help learn a little bit more about these topics. And I think depending on the relationship I have with people, or depending on where, I feel that a certain individual is in terms of where they want to learn about these issues, there might be different books that I might also encourage them to read. I just read Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo, which I thought was fantastic. And if any of you are higher education professionals, I would certainly caution you around her screed on higher ed and how, systems of white supremacy have permeated that space for a very long time. But it's also something that we have to acknowledge. It's something that I've done in my own work as a past co-chair of University's Equity Task Force. We've seen in outlets such as the High Country News that we've confronted issues of colonization and displacement among land-grant universities that were founded under the Morrill Act, and the displacement and the land grabs that were taken from our Native American populations therein. So it's a big, complex area, but what I think the genius of his book was to focus inherently on what it means to be an anti-racist, and those questions that were brought up initially by Danielle. He confronts that misconception that it's not merely enough to say I'm not racist. It's an active stage where we have to be anti-racist, right? And it brings to mind another resource that I would encourage people to learn about and read, called The Groundwater Approach, that was written by Bayard Love and Dina Hayes Green of the Racial Equity Institute, that brings about a metaphor for how structural racism has sort of permeated American society. And as part of that metaphor, they talk about, I believe, hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing it too much, a pond. If you find a dead fish in a pond, you're going to wonder why that fish died. Was there something in the water that poisoned it, right? Why do we have students who fail? Was there something that the teacher did? Was there something in their home life? And then that kind of contextualizes for us the reasons to see what components within society or within our little microcosms failed us. And so it's a good way to kind of see, historically, all of the ways that have allowed us to get where we are, that we do have to acknowledge history, and that history has yielded some very, very negative externalities, right? I think there are some people out there who feel that history, because it happened, it needs to be venerated, whereas we are realizing that there are wrongs that need to be corrected. Within the field of public administration proper, we herald, or at least had heralded, Woodrow Wilson as a founder of American public administration. And within the past few years, his name was stripped from the School of Public Affairs, Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, because of his known racism, because of his known gatekeeping of Black personnel and students out of Princeton University when he was president there. Prior to becoming governor of New Jersey, prior to becoming president of the United States. So we have to confront these issues and acknowledge that there are sometimes deleterious effects that have happened over the course of history. And I think what Dr. Kendi gives us is a great action plan for how to confront that, and to not merely say, to throw our hands up and say, whoa, hey, I'm not racist. Well, it's got to be more than that. It has to be actively examining what the conditions were that brought us to this point and how to change those.
Thank you both. Lisa in the chat asks, where do you think that this book doesn't go far enough? I know you've touched upon this briefly, Dr. Ronquillo, but is there anything else you want to reinforce with that, or?
I would add is a little footnote that we're in an age and era where, the information that is available to us is, not to use a tired metaphor, but like drinking from a fire hose, right? You have to make choices in terms of what it is you're willing to pick up and put down, and what it is that you're going to invest your time in. And so there's almost a bit of a competition for a very limited attention span that we collectively have sometimes. And so I think I would just say, and I'm struggling to figure out places where it didn't go far enough, because in many regards, I do think that Dr. Kendi's work, the proverbial went there, like, oh, he went there, right? Well, he needed to, in a lot of regards, as do many of these other folks who have talked about, topics of whiteness and white fragility. Robin DiAngelo, for example, her work. There are a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, if they can't be as comprehensive as we might feel they need to be, that's fine, because they are filling certain niche areas that I think are very important. Or even folks like Emmanuel Acho, right? Former NFL player, grew up here in the States, son of Nigerian parents, even talking about the differences between, African immigrants, but also folks who were descended from slaves in the United States, and looking at American Black culture versus the immigrant African culture, things of that nature that sometimes don't necessarily permeate our discourse, but really enhance our ability to understand that. And I don't come from those communities, and so I can't speak for them, but I can say that it was very much an illuminating thing. And I think put together, everybody makes their own contributions that really enrich this dialogue. So I can't point to anything specific where I feel that Dr. Kendi didn't go far enough, but I do believe that he fills a very important void in this discourse.
Awesome, thank you. We had another anonymous question. They say, do you think this book does a good job of convincing someone that wasn't already brought into the fact that racial disparities have and continue to exist, as well as what we need to do about them?
I don't want to risk talking too much. As a professor who's been doing this for a while, I mean, and I have a bunch of students on here who had me before, so you know this, that I can be a little loquacious. I think that's an excellent question. And I think that it all comes from that original point that I talked about in terms of positionality. I think sometimes we don't necessarily always see what our subconscious biases are. Even as an intersectional male who comes from a multicultural, multiracial background, I can't proclaim that I've never been without fault when it comes to my own biases, right? I think if there are people who are open enough to realizing, kind of the current social zeitgeist, if you're willing and open to be reached by what it is Dr. Kendi is saying, I do think that it can be a decent job of having people reflect. I think ultimately people who are in need of some deep changes, that takes a lot of work that no singular book can yield.
Yeah, I would echo that. I also think that as Dr. Kendi would point out, it's tough to generalize on topics like that. There's going to be some people that weren't bought in and this does change it for them. And there's going to be others that didn't. Something that I've always personally ascribed to is a lot of things we learn. We don't really necessarily learn them when we read them or when we engage them. Even for me, upon rereading this, there were things that hit differently for me this time than the first time I read it. And I probably would have answered the question, what did you disagree with, a lot differently the first time I interacted with this book. But I've since been able to reflect on a lot of those things and, recognize it came from my own understanding. I was misinterpreting something that Dr. Kendi was expressing, not necessarily disagreeing with his sentiment. That's a really hard thing to say. I mean, it's entirely possible that someone finishes this book and says, nope, that's not true. And then 10 years later, they're like, oh, I understand this now. So everyone's journey to anti-racism is going to look different.
Thank you. So the next question we have actually leads into another question we have. So I'm going to kind of combine them together. Jane mentioned in the chat, asks, how can we as educators and students create the spaces in our classrooms to do this work? For instance, what kind of preparation do we as teachers need to do to move equity and race dialogues forward? Which I think combines very nicely with the question of, returning to that question of policy and how, how we frame those stereotypes that we were speaking of against, like, say, housing policy, education policy, business policy, policing policy, and even education policy, as Jane mentions. So
I can start here. I don't have as much teaching experience as John, but from my perspective and from, what I take away from the book is start with the policies. So look at your school policies and your syllabi and make sure that those represent anti-racist ideas and anti-racist policies. Like, does someone reading your syllabus know that this is a safe place for them as a person of color? If not, you're probably not leading an anti-racist classroom, at least not in the way that we really see the work happening in the way that Dr. Kendi describes it. So yeah, I think starting with what the policies look like, and then making sure you're living that. So what does it look like? Personal, the thing I always go back to is reflection is key. So really looking at that, are you hearing from students of color? Are people bringing things up that are new information to you? Do people feel comfortable coming to you and saying something on the syllabus was harmful to them in some way? These are all ways that we can reflect on it, but if we're always changing and growing, so the reflection piece is really important to make sure that you're continuing to create a space for people. Because the second we stop changing and we stop reflecting and we stop adapting, then those racist ideas and policies really can kind of set in and take hold.
And I would agree with that. I think the policy becomes very important, especially when we look at what many of us do, right? Just being in the School of Public Affairs, I think that policy adds that element of the structural elements that have caused us to find ourselves in situations where issues of equity and equality and inclusion are harmed, right? And if anybody, and not to take attention away from Dr. Kendi's book, but there are so many other resources too that can highlight this. I think of Matthew Desmond, for example, who did a lot of work in his own book that focused on housing issues in Milwaukee, and illustrating that Milwaukee is probably one of the most, if not the most, de facto segregated cities in the United States. And we've seen heat maps and color maps where we see the density of certain groups and where they live. And one has to ask, well, how did it become that way, right? Because at certain points in time, it was very much legal to discriminate based on identity. We've seen policies that have needed to be changed. And so I think that this policy thread that Hope has tapped into is incredibly important for us to focus on when it comes to making those structural changes. And we've seen where there have been, controversial attempts to right those wrongs. Maybe some of those attempts have been good approaches, some have been harmful. We have a president of the United States who was embroiled in, some controversial policy issues around busing that have, flecked his entire political career, all up until the point to where he was finally elected and was lambasted about it by his very own vice president, who he ultimately chose. And I'm glad she did that because we need to confront these issues. And, I hope that he was able to truly change his own individual person, but ultimately, what is the most utilitarian value out of policy changes, especially within this realm? Like, are we making changes that are ultimately going to increase the quality of life for people who have been disenfranchised, marginalized, and othered, for scores of years. And I think that's, again, just to underline that the policy issue that Hope is identifying is a critical one. And I would love to see us further probe that if we can.
And I'll add on that too. There's a personal element to that too. Obviously, changing the policy is important, but on like a day-to-day, feelings in your body note that I think Dr. Kendi really hits on too is that it's important to recognize that we are all, we both have the potential to be racist and anti-racist, and we have all done racist things, and we will probably continue to do them. And part of the work is not letting that shame associated with failure and with doing something racist or perpetuating a racist idea, not letting that shame overtake the anti-racist work. So being able to welcome accountability. If as a teacher, a student comes to you and talks to you about something, if you feel defensive, that's okay. Don't let that turn into shame that shuts you down from having that conversation. Try to embrace it. I was listening to Dr. Kendi speak about something and he kind of spoke to being thankful for people who hold us accountable and who show up and say, hey, this is racist. Can we do something about that, instead of defending it and getting bogged down in that shame that can cause a lot of personal turmoil. Just receiving that with gratitude that someone cared enough about you to help you grow past it.
Thank you. We have a popular anonymous question that a lot of people have upvoted that they want to hear from. So I'm going to ask that now. Within such a polarizing political culture, is there a way for discussions like those in the book to punctuate the conservative part of the nation, those who would simply brand the book as another flashpoint in the race culture war?
That is an excellent question. And I think it's an important one, because if we are talking about principles of, justice, equity, diversity, and that inclusion, we can't, not to speak in such banal terms, we can't right the wrongs of the past while marginalizing and excluding people. It's hard to talk about, because I believe that we then pull into question some moral and ethical principles in terms of some of the harmful things that have been done. But I think that if there are points where we can try to foster dialogues with people who do find themselves on the more conservative side of the spectrum, that we should. I think that we have seen some glimmers of hope, but we've also seen issues like Charlottesville. We've also seen heinous acts committed by people who do align with more conservative values. And we need to find ways to approach that, either diplomatically or to find people who are going to be reasonable enough to come to the table and have those discussions. And having been in some political arenas myself over the course of my life, I can attest to the fact that that's a challenge. But and not to keep going back to this positionality, but again, going back to my own background, right? I have a grandfather who I was very close to, who was a white man born in Oklahoma, in Indian country as it happens, but he was white, World War II vet, dyed in the wool, Goldwater, Reagan conservative. And he used to give me books by George Will when I was in high school that I read out of respect and veneration for my grandfather, but vehemently disagreed with at the time. George Will has since left the Republican Party, for those who are unaware of that. But building that relationship, obviously in a familial aspect with my grandfather, was something that at least was able to let me take deep breaths and be open enough to folks who might come from that conservative side of the aisle, which we have to realize has changed dramatically in the past few years. I think it was much easier for us to find common points and kind of meet in the middle. And it's becoming more of a challenge. And I say that as objectively as possible without trying to demonize the other side. But I do think that having insights into my upbringing of my grandfather, again, World War II vet, grew up at the advent of the Great Depression, understanding why he believes what he believed is interesting. But I think that there is, to be very blunt, in certain cases, a devolution of thought, a contagion of ignorance that is making us paint some areas of conservatism, in some cases unfairly. I mean, at a certain point in time, we have to point out the wrongs and the things that have been bad. But if we are going to be truly inclusive, then we have to hold out that glimmer of hope to at least hope that there will be somebody who can come to the table with a rational inquiry in terms of how these issues can be brought within elements of conservative circles. This brings back into play, that policy thing again that Hope initially identified. If we are having elected officials, for example, who espouse certain values, if we are normalizing the violence and the hatred that we have seen from some of our elected political leaders of the past handful of years, that's a major social regression. And it's just something that I don't feel that we can afford. And it's a major threat. And so for the sake of our society, for the sake of our well-being, for the sake of our future generations, I truly hope that we can be able to permeate that conservative bubble with this conversation and make sure that they are coming to the table realizing that, hey, they also have in their circles persons of color, people who belong to the LGBT community, people who belong to groups that have otherwise been classified as marginalized historically. And so I would then say that it is necessary for those who, on the conservative side of the spectrum, to engage in these topics.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And to John's point about relating to his grandfather, I personally really stress that accountability requires care for the other person. You can't truly hold someone accountable if you don't regard that their humanity. And so I think in some ways where this book can punctuate the conservative part of the nation is through those relationships we have. I mean, most of my family lives in Texas, and a whole host of them are Trump supporters and would call this, book a liberal, whatever. But part of that is maintaining those relationships because they're still people that I love, and having those conversations with them and then holding them accountable in real meaningful ways and not, gotcha ways or spiteful ways. And I know I even, I absolutely suffer for them sometimes when I feel the urge to call someone out or hold someone accountable, I have to reflect on what's my true intention there. Is it really because I care about them and I want them to grow? Or is it because I kind of just want to point something out that they did? And I think that that's part of how we win in this race culture war. It's recognizing the humanity and even those people that are perpetuating racist ideas and notions, and they're just looking for someone to take care of them and someone to stand up for them too. And so we can do that through love and care, and that leads us to be able to hold them accountable too.
I would just tack on one little thing. Hope nailed it. We have to humanize this. We have to realize that we are all people. We all have feelings. It's tough to be authentic and vulnerable sometimes, but I think she's absolutely spot on. We have to realize that we can talk about it in these realms of social science and infuse them into our lines of research inquiry. But at the end of the day, we are human beings with beating hearts and thinking brains. And I think that is such a great point to illustrate.
Thank you both. I think you really hit upon humanizing, which leads me into, I'm going to pull these two questions together since I think they do have a lot of connection with each other. So what do successful anti-racist practice and policies have in common? What can we hopefully borrow or imitate? And then I'm going to pair that with Kendi believes we can defy the odds, heal society of racism, and create an anti-racist society. Do you equally believe that? And what needs to happen for this to occur?
So, one of my big takeaways from Dr. Kendi's book, and I think goes with the conversation of humanizing people is his concept about not relying on ideology, and focusing solutions on problems versus ideology. Even the ideologies that have led us to positive places are ultimately rooted in a problematic world. And if we rely too heavily on ideology without examining case by case problems and looking for solutions versus like ideology based solutions, like we think that everyone deserves this, so we should just do that, versus looking at really what the problem is. I think that is something that we can take away from it. Really focusing on the humanity of people, instead of these heuristics that we've created for like even labeling people as conservative or liberal or however. We start to like take these shortcuts that take the humanity out of it, and then we don't. Then our policies don't always reflect the problem we're trying to solve. So I think that was one of my big takeaways from his book that I think is important for us to imitate in the anti-racist effort, like taking every problem as it comes and really focusing on the humanity of it, not focusing on winning or ideology or getting your solution passed, your policy passed. And then also being willing to change, redirect, adapt when things don't work, because a lot of things don't work, especially in activism. And if we get stuck in our ways of this is how we want to win, or this is how we want to get this policy passed, that doesn't do us a lot of good.
I don't want to retread too much because I do agree with everything that Hope says. She's illustrated some really great points. I do want to latch on to, I don't know, Hope, you're kind of eponymous here, right? Because your own name is where I wanted to go with this, because what Danielle mentioned about, Dr. Kendi being optimistic, saying, I do, that we can move forward, that we can create a better society in situations where we do improve. I agree. I mean, I try to instill in my own views a healthy dose of optimism, because I think it is in some cases, and not to, I think it is simple enough in some cases to just say, you have to behave how you want to be. So if you want to be actively anti-racist, you have to put that into practice. You have to take the steps to emulate the type of person that you want to be. And it's hard I'm not a psychologist, but I do believe, that public administration also deals a great deal with behavior at both individual and organizational levels. And so I think that changing behaviors when we're cognizant of the need to change is something that is going to be something that will help advance us. That's going to come off incredibly naive to some people, and I'm aware of that. But I am willing to bask in that naivete, because if it helps us advance these discussions into more proactive actions that lead to better improvements in society, better race relations, better treatment of protected classes, then I'm going to be all for it. And I can only speak for myself in that, and saying that because of books like Dr. Kendi's that make me reflect upon it not being enough to just say, I'm not racist. Well, being an anti-racist calls into question whether or not you're willing to prove that. And there are examples abound of, what certain things are that are racist that we're claiming, because inherently nobody wants to claim that. Nobody is going to throw their hands up and say, all right, I admit it, I'm, a bona fide racist. There might be some over the course of history, like David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan. But for the most part, most of us want to be good members of society that give some sort of contribution to it. And so I feel that that's some of where Dr. Kendi's optimism comes from, and optimism that I hope I share in, if I understand what it is that he is writing in the book correctly.
Thank you both so much for hitting on that concept of hope. I think you really hit upon like why hope is so central to the anti-racist movement. I guess the final question that before we go through the last few little questions in the chat is, what is giving you hope?
Something that gives me hope all the time is just how our language has evolved. I mean, I remember when conversations like these just were not happening and we didn't have words for things like fat phobia or, gender racism. And these feelings that I had when interacting with the world were just amorphous, bad feelings of discomfort and shame and hurt. So that's something that gives me hope, is that we are talking about these things so much so that we have the language for it now. We have scholars researching it. We have practitioners talking about it and doing the work. And we have people that are much more open to these conversations. And even, as I've been pursuing my PhD, I am always so grateful for how receptive folks are when I bring up things that maybe are new to them or they don't feel comfortable talking about. So this evolution towards talking about things, talking about our feelings, talking about our shame and our hurts and the shame we've caused and the hurt we've caused, and giving names to these, real societal issues that a lot of us feel and have felt for a long time. And I know my ancestors felt and didn't have the words to express. So that's something that gives me a lot of hope every day. It's just that our language is evolving to credit and validate the things that we've been feeling for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I appreciate Hope invoking her ancestors, because I referenced my relative's book. And for anyone who's interested, it's called In the Shadow of the Freeway by Lydia Otero. Reading that book helped me firm up my belief in intergenerational trauma, because I learned things about my ancestors that I knew had happened, including, how or that my great-grandfather, for example, met an untimely death, but learning the actual facts of that spoke to me in a way that I had never felt before, and it was hard to read. That just a few generations ago, that's how somebody within my family was being treated, but now I have had the opportunity, the great fortune, and I would say privilege, of becoming a professor at a Research One institution. And so that kind of bridges into what gives me hope is my students, I think, are probably one of the better reflections of what gives me hope. Having done this for 10 years, having been in a classroom in Chicago and Denver over the course of 10 years, I have had just these incredibly inquisitive minds come in to classes that I've always viewed as sort of toolkit classes, right? I've never been somebody who's wanted to be a gatekeeper or a bottlenecker. My whole MO in being an educator is making sure that I'm equipping my students with tools that will help them. And knowing that the students come into my classrooms with a great deal of knowledge already, but I've seen over the course of time, the way attitudes change, the way I feel that they've changed for the better, the action orientation, the desires to create a more equitable and just future and society. I think that is reflected in my students more than any other facet of my life that I can think of, because that's where I get that direct application. I learn as much from them as I hope they learn from me. They push me to do better. And I think that is a great font of hope. And I would also just add and maybe conclude this thought that, oftentimes we see that there are social norms that come about because there was a certain way of being and feeling. And so people begin to adopt these things. And you've probably seen that distribution curve, where we have this group of innovators, at the early stages of that curve. And I've shown this video in class of this guy who's dancing at a concert at a festival, and he's I don't know, some people might view him as making a fool out of himself, but he's just feeling himself, right? He's having a good time, he's dancing. And then what happens? Pretty soon we see somebody else who joins in, right? He's like, that guy's having a good time, I'm gonna go dance with him. And then you get into this early adopters stage where all of a sudden people are like, hey, this looks like fun. We're gonna go dance too. And then the shape of the curve, hits its peak, and then it normalizes a little bit. And I feel that in a lot of ways, even for some of these changes that need to be made, we need to be daring enough to be that solo dancer, to realize that, we can have a tipping point. I show that video in classes on leadership because it helps us analyze a little bit, like, who's the real leader here? Is it the innovator who started dancing by himself, or is it the first person to follow that then brings more followers? And so these are the questions that I hope that we can also infuse as we continue to look at how we want to move forward in being anti-racists, and if that's what we want, and that's something that I hope that we do want.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge and expertise. In the interest of time, so that everyone can get out of here, when we said we would, I just want to again thank our panelists on behalf of the Social Equity Committee and the School of Public Affairs. And I want to remind everyone that we're going to have 2 more events, so keep an eye out for that. And we hope that we will see you again. And thank you. Have a good day.